ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Ticklish Business, the podcast all about honoring and celebrating classic film. And this week, I am flying solo, part of my new solo podcasting venture while Emily enters book world. We are so proud of her. But we are going to be honoring the late, great Diane Keaton with a look at 1987's baby boom. And to join celebrate this movie and talk about Diane Keaton and why this movie is so wonderful, I am joined by the awesome and amazing Kate Hagen. Kate, how are you?
I'm hanging tough, doing my best. It's great to see you, Kristen. I'm excited to talk about a great movie.
Yes. I was trying to think of people that would have something to say, and Kate and I bond on our love for the erotic thriller. So 80s, 90s movies tend to be our jam. And I until you said off camera that this was one of your favorites, I was just hoping dumb luck would work in my favor. I was like, this seems like something Kate would be into. So I was really happy.
We got a James Spader as a yuppie sighting, so that's like a minimum 2.5 stars for me.
I think that's where it came from. Subconsciously, I was like, the Spader factor. Who do I know that is a Spader superfan? Kate! So, yeah. But before we get into that, I would love to remind you, our Patreon keeps the lights on at Ticklish Biz HQ and lets us do all sorts of great things. I'd like to thank all of our patrons. I haven't been thanking them in a minute, but, Shawn Goodreau, Chris McKay, our new patron, Kate G. Thank you so much for joining us. A button called Smalls. A lot of you guys continue to make this great podcast what it is. I appreciate you hanging in through all the ups and downs, and patrons get all sorts of cool stuff. They get access to these episodes 48 hours early. We have a whole mess of bonus content that is exclusive to the podcast. Please head over to patreon.com/ticklishbiz to learn more. And if you are watching this on our YouTube channel, thank you. We appreciate it, because we are slowly trying to make video a thing, because it is a thing for everything now. So let's jump into, baby boom. And Kate, for people that don't know you, you do all sorts of amazing things in your free time. Give listeners an overview of who you are, what you do.
I really love artists who tend to wear a lot of different hats and have like chameleonic tendencies. And I don't think about that often with my own life, but I guess I do a lot of different things. She said doo-doo. Okay, so I work for The Blacklist. I've been working there since 2013, longest relationship of my life. I'm one of the SVPs there now. I run our comms in addition to doing some programming and some really cool sort of side stuff, including 2 years ago, we got to do a 20th anniversary Blacklist series with the American Cinematheque. And then in all my spare time, I also do some freelance writing for outlets like Playboy, Letterboxd. I have a couple of essays in Vinegar Syndrome releases, along with Kristen, which is very cool. My sort of big interest areas as a viewer are, like Kristen said, I love the erotic thriller. I love erotic cinema. I think the conversation around sex at the movies is actually a very topical and political one. I love the Great American Teen movie, and particularly from the 80s and 90s. I also love, to your point, Kristen, just a good old meat and potatoes domestic drama from that era that we're not making anymore. And some of my earliest writing was really geared towards women in horror, and I'm a big advocate for women in genre too. But I don't know, in my spare time, I've been trying to catch them all since 1999. I play a lot of Pokemon, and I love going to the movies here in LA.
You also love documenting movie theaters too. You've been doing work in that space. I love that you have Blacklist, all of these amazing things, Pokemon player amongst them. That is great. And James Spader superfan. I cannot stress this enough. If there's one person, it's Kate.
This might be the 6th or 7th podcast I've done with the Spader component, and I am happy to continue carrying that mantle forward. Somebody's got to do it.
I will need you to give us some Spader backstory when we get to that in this movie, because it's so gratifying to watch him get his comeuppance in this movie at the hands of Diane Keaton. But if you have not seen Baby Boom, and you should, it is a Charles Shire, Nancy Meyers joint. Shire directed, and they both wrote it. It tells the story of J.C. Wyatt, played by Diane Keaton, who is known as the Tiger Lady. She is a hyper businesswoman with a capital B and a capital W, who works at a marketing firm. She is on the road to a promotion, and then she is tasked with picking up a item that she has supposedly inherited from a cousin she hasn't seen since the 50s. Turns out that that cousin has bequeathed her his daughter, Elizabeth, and JC is now responsible for caring for a baby, but she doesn't know anything about babies, and thus must figure out how to balance career and childhood, or motherhood, excuse me, and ultimately decides to retreat to the wilds of Vermont, where she finally figures out how to balance those two apparently diametric things. I love Baby Boom. I think that we both come at this, we love this movie, but we also understand that it is very much a product of 1987. And it's been fascinating to really kind of start researching. I kind of knew that I would be pulling very heavily from this book, Susan Faludi's Backlash. If you have not read it, you should. It's a seminal piece about feminism and pop culture in the 1980s. I knew what Susan Faludi says about this movie, but in researching more contemporary viewpoints of the film, it's been really cool to see people come back around to actually this movie is really progressive. It just didn't know it at the time. So I'm really excited to get into that. But outside of all of that, I mean, it's a Shire Meyers film. So it's got impeccable settings. Everything is like swathed in exquisite chintz when she's in Vermont, and exquisite minimalism when she's in New York. Diane Keaton is great. This was, according to her, a very different role that she had gotten to play in 1987. And some fantastic baby acting. We'll talk about that because the child actors in this film are impeccable. You know, for me, it's another great movie for women in the 1980s, in a time period where women were simultaneously being pushed and pulled in different directions. And I think it plays with all of that very well, and it's still very timely. Kate, what are your early memories of this movie? What do you think of it overall?
You know, I was thinking about the first time I saw this movie, and I can't answer that question because I watched a ton of movies with my maternal grandmother growing up, and Baby Boom was like a number one greatest hit in her house. We watched Baby Boom a lot when I was a kid, so I've seen it many times. You know, my big takeaway for doing the full rewatch ahead of this episode was, wow, not that much has changed in 40 years. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I think the contours of some of what JC is dealing with have changed, and some of the, you know, just practical reality. But this idea of the woman, quote unquote, having it all hasn't really shifted in the 40 years since. You know, the burden of labor when it comes to childcare and child rearing still falls on women most of the time. You know, we're coming out of this era of sort of girl boss feminism of like, well, if I just work 5 times as hard, I can keep up with the boys. When in reality, we live in a really misogynist, capitalistic, white supremacist society that really, you know, diminishes the work of women, both in the workplace and in the home. And I don't know, like, I'm an easy mark for these Meyers Shires joints. Like, we used to make things in this country, just like very serious middle budget movies. But that was my big takeaway on this rewatch, is just, in some ways, we've come very far. In other ways, we are still trying to answer a lot of these same questions. I love that you pulled out Backlash. This movie did get me thinking about the sort of yuppie cinematic canon, for better or worse, and it definitely fits within that, and how that sort of led to some of the legal thrillers of the 90s, something like Disclosure that traffics in some of these issues, but in a very different direction. But yeah, man, I love Baby Boom. We used to just cast a bunch of great middle-aged actors in movies and said, show us what you can do. And that was fine. We could do that again, guys.
I watched Ella McKay this week. Speaking of other directors that used to make things, James L. Brooks, and watching that and knowing how some of those, you know, directors of the 80s and 90s, they've struggled, right, to acclimate to what filmmaking. I'm wearing a Rob Reiner shirt right now. Rob Reiner certainly struggled as a filmmaker to make movies in the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. I feel like they are trying really hard to make movies from that time period, but like the magic is gone. Like the secret sauce or something or whatever was in the water we were drinking. It's just not working in the same way. I love that Nancy Meyers is continuing to make movies. She's going to make another one, but I do worry that like, can Nancy Meyers make a movie that is a Nancy Meyers movie in 2026 or 27 whenever this movie comes out?
It's going to be really interesting, right? I will out myself. I'm an Ella McKay defender. I think it's a fascinating late movie from books. That's a different podcast, but it is really interesting. You know, I also just saw Send Help, the Sam Raimi movie, which felt like such a return to form for him after a couple wilderness years. And that felt really nice to be like, yeah, guys, we can just make a $40 million meat and potatoes thriller. But I don't know. I find all these Meyers Shires joints to hold up incredibly well. The last time I watched Father of the Bride, I was like, so incredibly moved by the last 15 minutes. I like needed to like take a minute after the movie. And I've seen Father of the Bride many times. It never made me cry before. I was like, wow, I'm getting old, or I just miss old 90s.
That was me last week also watching Father of the Bride, which thank Lord love TNT and TBS for continuing to put those movies on a loop. But I think with something like Baby Boom, the Shire Meyers union is what makes it part of what makes it endure. They had come out in the early 80s. They kind of set the tone of the decade with Private Benjamin, which is another movie I unabashedly love. And Private Benjamin also is a film that suffers from a lot of the 1980s deconstruction of feminism. And they had also just done, I think, the other Goldie Hawn movie, Protocol, which they had a lot of issues with that script because the character of the Goldie Hawn plays was presented as far more politically inclined. The film was far more politically daring, and they had to really work with the studio system to get that into shape. And, Faludi kind of gives them shit for it, saying that they just turned Goldie Hawn's character into the same bubble-headed ditz that she is in all of her other movies. So I don't necessarily think they had much option in how they were going to. They had some power in how they're writing characters, but at the end of the day, studio's going to studio, and you can only do so much with what you're given. And to watch Baby Boom, what I still find so great about it, like you said, is that JC is a character desperate to have the yuppie lifestyle and the workaday prestige, but it's clear that she wants other things, which is she's always looking at the ads about vacation homes, and her boyfriend's like, yeah, but you never actually take a vacation. She wants to find this world of balance where she can continue to work, but at her own pace. It's not that she ever wants to stop working. That is the problem for her. When she gets to Hadleyville in the third act of the movie, is that she is not working. She doesn't have a purpose. And I do appreciate that the movie doesn't say not working is the only thing that a woman can do. And you get defenders and critics saying that ultimately the movie's whole emphasis on her creating a business around her child, the country baby food thing, well, that's women should only be working in maternal positions. And I don't know if that's necessarily an accurate way to interpret where this movie goes.
Yeah, it feels a little reductive to me. I mean, there's the great old joke of hate your 9 to 5, start working for yourself, and you'll work 24/7.
Yep.
It really makes me think about Nancy Meyers' personal background, too, because I know she sort of transitioned from working in development to being a writer herself. But one of my white whales of like Hollywood stories that I would love to know more about is I know she also had a very successful cheesecake business. Nancy Meyers, please drop the cheesecake recipe. I would love to know.
Yes.
If there's no way that woman doesn't make an incredible cheesecake. But it made me think about like, oh, did she start sort of doing what JC does of like, okay, I had my kids. I don't want to go back to being the quote unquote tiger lady that I maybe was in development, but I also don't only want to be a mom. And how can I sort of work within that system to do the kind of work that fulfills me, but also is my own terms. And I love that, big spoilers going to the end of the movie, she has the option at the end of the movie to chase this very male capitalistic version of success. And she says, thanks, but no thanks, which to me sort of really underlines like, this is a very personal choice for her. This is something that she's doing from a very personal and active place. Like, this is not being forced upon her. Maybe if the motherhood was, and we'll get to some of the conversations about parenting in this movie, but I really appreciated on this rewatch, like everything that JC does is JC's choice, and it doesn't feel like things are just happening to her as a result of the plot. There are moments where she could very easily swerve another way, and she really gets to the brass tacks of like, no, this is actually what I want here. And I think there's something really empowering in that.
There is, and so much of what baby boom represents is all of what was going on in the time. And I would love to hear from people that are Gen Z, and Gen Alpha who discover this movie, who have absolutely no idea about the background of what was going on in the 1980s. I mean, I was, a late 80s baby. I didn't live through the 80s. But at the same time, I feel like millennials had more access to culture beyond our lived experience. We had shows that talked about things. We had books that tell us things, and I point to Faludi in the sense that she talks about that there were a lot of things going on post second wave feminism. So second wave feminism happens in the 70s, and then in the 80s you get this quote unquote backlash that results in all of these different things that happen. And part of what she talks about is that they emphasized that there was an infertility epidemic in the 1980s, which was more the concept of this extension of birth dearth, which is women were not having enough children. Sound familiar? They denounced liberated women for choosing, she puts that in italics, to have fewer or no children. They didn't pretend that they were just neutrally reporting statistics. They proudly admitted that they were seeking to manipulate female behavior. So instead of kind of forcing women into this, it's now or never, like your biological clock is ticking, you have to do it. She says, quote, the birth dearth theorist tried appealing to society's baser instincts, xenophobia, militarism, and bigotry, to name a few. If white, educated, middle-class women don't start reproducing, the birth dearth men warned, paupers, fools, and foreigners would, and America would soon be out of business. So again, it's all pretty. Everything stems from racism. You gotta love that. And you get a lot of movies in the 1980s that are baby focused. Look Who's Talking, Three Men and a Baby, this film, For Keeps, She's Having a Baby. I mean, you can name like several. And all of these were, according to Faludi, attempts to reiterate that women should be having children. But these movies often were, I know, between this and something like Look Who's Talking, we're often about upwardly mobile white women having babies. Kirstie Alley in Look Who's Talking is a very successful accountant who is in an affair with a married man, which, of course, the fact that Amy Heckerling wrote and directed that and based it all off of Harold Ramis, who is in this movie, the wreath in Hollywood, the family wreath is small. But it's fascinating to watch those movies and emphasize that things like money are never factored in. These aren't women who are not having children because they're financially unable to. It's the fact that they are making this active choice. But these movies also aren't looking at the logistics of having a child and how that affects your finances. So a lot of these movies do, I think, live in a fantasy world where it's like, well, these are women that you clearly aren't. Me as a, lower middle class woman is like, okay, well, this isn't supposed to be me. This is wish fulfillment. But they're emphasizing that these aren't real problems. And that's, I think, always a sticky thing when you're talking about women of 80s movies.
Yeah, and it is a fantasy, right? Like, I remember even as a kid when she just like opens the paper, picks the house in Vermont and buys it. Like, the idea that you just have enough money saved that you can not only buy this big rambling country house on the East Coast, but you can also just like commit to living there forever without an additional job lined up is unfathomable in 2026 terms, and I think there is like a real sort of, maybe fairy tale is not the correct way of framing this, but a sort of wish fulfillment thing happening with a lot of these movies, have the baby and everything will come your way. Kirstie Alley, have your adulterous boss's baby because it's going to lead you to John Travolta, the true love of your life. Even in this, right? Like, JC, you have to go to the country with Elizabeth and start your life over so you can meet local town hot veterinarian Sam Shepard. Like, it's sort of still, I think, for better or worse, presenting this myth to women that, like, you just have to make a couple of really good decisions and everything will start flowing your way. And I'm not saying that's not true. We can all make some better decisions in our lives than we do sometimes. But, I do think there is, to your point about the upwardly mobile white woman, this is a very narrow lane of femininity and how particular women get to move through the world. And, frankly, it's still coming up. I feel like the conversation about the birth rate right now is still coming from this very sort of like white supremacist place of like, oh, we need more white babies. Why aren't white women having children? And it's so icky. It's so icky. To say enough of the fact that we're having a conversation about women generally is just incubators. But
yeah. What
it's interesting.
I think. Oh, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and I mean, it's hard to ignore the whiteness of the Shire Meyers world. That's something they've always, been accused of emphasizing. I mean, even JC's help that she is looking for, there's some kind of cringe-inducing jokes about her nanny's choices. Like one of them, is a woman of color that shows up in like a full covering and whatnot. So of course she finds her two choices for nannies are, white perky Victoria Jackson, which honestly might have dodged a bullet there. And then the, staunch German woman, these two very pinnacles of whiteness, even though we know, most help is women of color, or at least lower income women.
There's an article I will recommend to every person listening to this podcast. It's like 15 years old. It's from The Atlantic. It's called How Serfdom Saved the Women's Movement. And it's about how second wave feminism was able to happen because of all these prominent white feminists were doing exactly as you said, hiring support staff that were often lower income people of color so that they could go off in the world and be Gloria Steinem. Really fascinating in context of a movie like this.
And when you look at what Meyers and Shire, I mean, they talk about, they did research, right, on this character. This is a character that does exist in some semblance of reality, and they based it on management consultant with a Harvard MBA. And this is from Faludi, and she's quoting Meyers, who said, "She was so torn by the whole thing," Meyers says. "It was so hard for her. She didn't know what to do. What their model, Nadine Braun, didn't do, however, was give up work. She managed to find love and marry too, despite the career. She's not even particularly torn," she says. And she goes on to talk about how, Braun did not, give up working. She's worked for a consulting firm. She runs her own money management business at the time. And she said, her marriage was stronger because both she and her husband have, quote, full lives. She has no desire to become a country housewife. And I do think that that's something that makes baby boom, kind of interesting, in that for every choice that JC makes that I love, there's another one that she makes where you're just like, yeah, but that's your privilege, girl. Like, I love the fact that her relationship with Steven, the Harold Ramis character, it's clear that they have no interest in each other. There's one like implied sex scene that lasts 4 whopping minutes, which again, I don't know if Harold Ramis was telling on himself in certain instances, but I have very staunch opinions about Harold Ramis. And the fact that he's not into this whole her having a child thing. He makes fun of her at one point, saying like, "I thought I heard your biological clock ticking." And when she decides not to give up the baby and shows up at the train station with the child, and he just the look on his face, the audience is like, yes, that's great. She, as Madonna said, in this same time period, like, she's keeping her baby. And I love that. I love that. If this was a movie that I think was truly reductive, then yes, she would give up the child to save the relationship, and she doesn't. Everything that she does is about adapting to the life that she wants to have. And I think that Jezebel did a really cool article a couple years ago, where they call the movie one that shows, quote, how nearly impossible it is to be a working mother and get taken seriously in the corporate world. JC does everything you're supposed to do. And they go on to say she gets a nanny. She tries to make the relationships with the employees work. And it is Spader who's kind of undermining her, and everybody just kind of allows it. And as somebody that has worked in a corporate field and has experienced misogyny in the workplace, it's hard not to be like, I wish JC had just sued this company, because I'm pretty sure she would have won.
Yeah, maybe 2026 JC does sue that company, right? Like, I think the movie does a really great job in its first half of really creating a lot of obstacles for JC. Like you said, there are many points where she could make a different decision, and it feels very genuine and very earned. Like, there's that whole montage with her and Harold Ramis when they're trying to like take care of the baby for the first night. And like, you legitimately feel like, oh my God, these people are so clueless. How are they going to do this? And
that is still the perfect plate of pasta that they create for her. Perfect.
Totally.
Chef's kiss.
Beautiful. And then, we see her try to make it work at work, as you said, doing all the quote unquote right things, and it still doesn't work. She checks all the boxes. She's being as good of an employee as she can. There's that great shot of her in the office when it's just her and the cleaner. And I think particularly a dynamic that still happens frequently is, older woman at a corporate sort of elevated position gets immediately undermined by a young whippersnapper man just because he's a young whippersnapper man, when in reality, she's the one with all the expertise and sort of context and, actual ability to do the job. And, the second half of the movie is a bit of a fantasy, but I appreciate that before we get there, you're really grounded in like, well, what else was she supposed to? She's trying really hard to make this all work and it's not working. So as you said, she just kind of adapts and keeps moving.
Yeah, watching this, you're always tempted to say, well, how could she, like you said, how could she have made this work? And the answer is that the deck is stacked against her. From the minute that she gets this child, you see the other characters around her change. So the whole concept is that there's really nothing she can do. It's everybody else. It's society's problem that has the issue with women having children. It's not women having children. Like that, I think, is the thing that does not get discussed enough. The minute that her boss sits her down to that dinner and says, my wife does everything for me. I don't even, I think there's another scene in Parenthood where Steve Martin is having this conversation with his boss, and the boss is telling him, like, I don't even know my kids' names. Like, I don't even interact with them. And the emphasis often is that what we're seeing now, and I think that the backlash is different for this movie now in 2026, because you are seeing Gen Z and Gen Alpha. I mean, I don't know if Gen Alpha is working, but Gen Z especially kind of demanding that work-life balance and saying work is not what defines me. I'm going to do what I want and live my life. And they don't really care. Whereas millennials, I think baby boom still hits us in that sense of we've been so conditioned to have our job define our personality, and that's what's going to lead to this idea of personal happiness. And we know that that's a fantasy, but we still chase it. So it's so interesting to watch her kind of be like, I want to keep working, but I'm not going to be able to do it in this world of yuppies. And this movie is very much kind of starting to, the yuppie lifestyle in this New York rat race starts to become a detriment in movies of the late 80s as you get into the 90s. And by the 90s, by the time Reality Bites comes out, the whole like Gen X, like screw the man, nobody wants to work at the Gap thing takes over and really closes it out. But I love the ingenuity that she has. And I think that it's also worth pointing out that, people have talked about how quickly the third act develops, as she's getting all these things with Country Baby. And people are like, that's unrealistic. That would take months. And I'm like, yeah, that's the point, is that she's able to do this all in, months, and prove to the company that like she was their best employee. You maybe should have worked with her a little bit to accommodate some of her things, because she actually was smart and competent.
Yeah, and I also think it's that, sort of idealized version of the American dream too, right? Like she retreats from the city life to go to the country life. She creates a product to fulfill a need in her own life. She realizes that that product might have value to other people. She figures out a way to market it thanks to her savvy and expertise. And then it becomes this big sensation. I also love just like the yuppie angle of like organic baby food in the 80s. It's really funny to me. That's such a clever particular thing to have her work on, the idea of like there's that great montage when she's taking Elizabeth to all the like really fancy early childhood classes in New York, and just this unreality of child rearing for most people. And I really appreciate that that's one of the things that she takes a look at and is like, you know what, we're not going to do this. I'm taking the kid to the country and we're going to read some books, and that's going to be fine, actually.
Well, and so much of that too, her desire to educate Elizabeth and compete with the other moms. Again, all of that is emphasizing what the birth dearth movement was telling people, which is that, if you have the poor and you have the foreigners having babies, babies are going to be dumber. And there was this real critique against, people, children were getting dumber and the IQ was lowering. And so you get a lot of these movies. And I do think that this movie rejects that concept, that it's really not beneficial, and it's kind of silly to watch a small child on uneven bars like swinging back and forth, which I think that scene is hilarious, and I want to know how they accomplished that, if that was a real small child that just had great upper body strength. I love that. But I don't think you could have had anybody else play this part other than Diane Keaton. There were Goldie Hawn. I could see. I know Kim Basinger was offered the role and turned it down, which I'm just like, why? That's somebody's name I would not have pulled out in 1987. But this was a real kind of game changer for Diane Keaton. She had done comedy before, more specifically with Woody Allen. That's a very specific type of comedy. She had come off Reds and a bunch of other more serious movies. Supposedly, when she came out dressed in the suits that she wears and has the makeup and the hair, the crew was supposedly so shocked because they were used to her dressed like Annie Hall, in her more like, haphazard clothing. And she joked that like, oh, she actually looked like a female of the species, which I was like, Diane, you are gorgeous, girl. Like, own it. I love it. And I think that most people watch this movie and when I've shown this to people that have never seen it, they're really surprised at how great an actress Diane Keaton was, because I think they're so used to seeing her overly manic, like, breakdown characters that she often has. And she really only has like one big breakdown moment with the well, when she goes to when she's moved to Vermont and she's discovered that her roof is leaking, and then she realizes that her well has run dry, which double entendre much. And she has this whole speech about how she just wants to get water from. She doesn't want to know where it comes from. And honestly, I've had that day where you just want your things, and you're like, I don't want to know about the fate of the free world. And I love that. I love that she is able to take these big swings between emotions and make it look so natural and organic. I don't think she got enough credit for that in her career. And when she's doing the more like serious business moments, when she's dressing down Spader for trying to use her office, all of that just feels like you're like, yeah, I would definitely whimper in for businesswoman Diane Keaton. And yet she has these real tender moments with the child actors playing Elizabeth, or with Sam Shepard at the like ye old barn dance. And she's got a real like Barbara Stanwyck vibe to her, that I don't think she gets enough credit for.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bringing up this being a pivotal point in her career, because I had never really considered that, but you're totally right. Like, this is kind of the movie in which she becomes not the Annie Hall Diane Keaton, not the super serious Diane Keaton, but like the sort of beloved cultural figure Diane Keaton.
Yeah, everybody's mom.
everybody's mom in the 90s. And I really appreciated on this rewatch her physicality throughout and how it changes. You know, the first half of the movie, we see her in these very sort of rigid environments. So she is rigid in response to them. And then as soon as Elizabeth enters, you start to see these like moments of really, really great physicality and physical comedy in particular from her. I've seen the movie a million times. I lost my shit at the scene when she's trying to go to the lunch with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is just like flopping and she's trying to like manage the baby in her arms. And you said about the freak out scene at the well, which is just like peak, uncut Keaton. She's so good at making her body demonstrate the emotional turmoil that she's in a way that's still really funny. And, like you said about some of the more dramatic moments with Elizabeth, totally true. I also think she really nails the romantic elements of this film. Her and Sam Shepard have incredible chemistry. I mean, who didn't have great chemistry with Sam Shepard? But, their first meeting after she's passed out and wakes up in his vet office, leading to like their great first kiss moment, to Ye Olde Barn Dance. Her ability to sort of switch modes in this movie is really, really impressive. And I think we start to see that in her ongoing career from this point on, whereas prior to this, it felt like it's either like comedic Diane Keaton or dramatic Diane Keaton. You don't get best of both worlds.
Yeah, so much of her need to control in this movie comes from a genuine place. I think every woman, I mean, regardless of whether you have children or not, like I get a pet sitter for my cats and I'm nervous about like, is somebody a kidnapper and going to steal my animals? So, you feel for her when she's freaking out over seeing a newspaper article about, kidnapping and thinking that she needs to get her nanny's information from Germany to find out if, she'll pass a background check. All of it feels genuine. It's just kind of cranked up a notch, and I think you need an actor with that ability to do that and not make it seem just manic and bipolar almost. The fact that she has that tick with the leg that's shaking under the table, that says so much about the type of person that JC is. And what I appreciated and I noticed this time around, and Faludi really gives the movie guff for the ending where JC gives up the deal with the company because she has this veterinarian that she's seeing, and I think Faludi says like she's giggling and like it turns into this really like wimpy girly moment, but yet the relationship she has with Sam Shepard is not necessarily one of equals because they have different spheres, and that's what makes it work. Is that he's not in the corporate rat race. He kind of tempers her and forces her to slow down. Yet when they do eventually sleep together the next morning and he comes into the kitchen and the kid calls him dad in something like Look Who's Talking, that's the ending culmination moment of Look Who's Talking, spoiler alert, because it's the concept of we've created this nuclear family. That's the moment. It's not about Kirstie Alley's realization, it's the fact that she's found a man that her child will like. Whereas Baby Boom doesn't do that. She just kind of like laughs it off like, well, any man figure that she meets is probably going to be daddy. And the end of the movie, it's not her and Sam Shepard reuniting that is the end of the film. It's her and Elizabeth reuniting. And that, I think, is something that, again, if this was a movie that wanted to emphasize kind of nuclear family and all of that, I think it would have ended with all three of them reunited, and the concept of like he's gonna put a ring on it doesn't do that, and I love that.
It doesn't do that. And I mean, the bravest thing she does in the whole movie is when she decides to keep Elizabeth. And the fact that that is the note that we like, that is the boldest thing we get to see JC do. And that boldness is rewarded in that really, really lovely final shot with the two of them. It's just, it feels so genuine and so earned in a way that something like Look Who's Talking feels a little bit like tacked on and treacly. Sorry to Look Who's Talking, a fine movie that made billions of dollars adjusted for inflation.
And like you were saying with, mining the emotion out of something like, Father of the Bride, is very much a sentimental type of movie. But I think that this is one of those movies where, the choices don't feel manipulative. And I think that's, again, another Meyers Shire element to their work is that, when she goes to the adoption agency with the baby and she's prepping to give her to this couple, which, I mean, they certainly make them fairly horrible. They're going to be moving to Iowa and they're going to name the baby Fern, and she calls her husband Sir. But she, the fact that she spends, what was it, 100, and she spends thousands of dollars on clothes and toys is like an apology for giving her up. And then when she leaves the adoption office and you hear the baby crying and you're like, God, what is going on here? It feels like an earned moment. She the tiger lady that's going to walk away, or does she come back? And I know that the two of Meyers and Shire, they said that they based this a lot on 1940s films, specifically Bachelor Mother and Woman of the Year. And I think the Bachelor Mother thing is so important because that is also another movie where, the character that Ginger Rogers plays is certainly a not a professional woman, but she's a working girl who wants to just live her life and lucks into this, having this baby, which in the original script was supposed to be her baby, but they didn't do that because of the Hays Code. And even at the end of that movie, the fact that she does decide to learn how to be a mother, I think is it feels so organic to that character, even though you could probably argue, oh, it's a step back.
A lot of times in the world of screenwriting, we talk about watching a character make active decisions, watching a character make really, clear decisions. And I think this movie is a really great example of that first act of seeing her just reject. I'm not going to do this. And it's until that point when she starts walking away. And it's like, I'm at the point in my life, I'm not going to have biological children. That's fine. That ship has sailed. But also, you do start to ask yourself those questions like, oh my God, if my best friends who had a baby, if they both died and somebody was like, Kate, you need to take care of this baby, I would be like, yeah, I'm probably making the same choice as JC there, even though it seems like that's not to be a part of my life. I also think, speaking of choices, it's really interesting thinking about Faludi seeing her not taking the deal as some kind of failure, because that feels very 90s corporate, corporations are our friends, these billionaires do have our best interests in mind. And then 30 years of world history has proven those things are not true and correct. And really, JC being able to stay autonomous, to own her brand, to keep Country Baby fully hers, that's a way bolder choice. That's a way more interesting thing to do. And, we see it in everybody from Bethany Frankel to the Kardashians to Jessica Alba now of no, this is my thing. I'm going to hold on to this as long as I can. And if I'm going to take a payout, it's going to be a big payout, which is so interesting.
We talk now so much about private equity ruins everything, right? And I feel like watching this, you're just like, yeah, she knows private equity ruins everything, which I think is so cool. I mean, we talk about this being a game changer for Diane Keaton. Give me the Spader rundown for people that are, where does this fit in his oeuvre?
So this is him sort of transitioning out of being the teen bad hottie in things like Pretty in Pink or The New Kids to doing some more sort of young professional roles, but he still hasn't broken out yet. This is 2 years before Sex, Lies, and Videotape. So I think people are still sort of seeing him in this kind of arch villain role. It's funny, he kind of has a little trifecta of movies around this. So it's Baby Boom, Mannequin, and Wall Street, where he's just, his character in Wall Street is a little bit, more well-behaved than the other two, but just these kind of absolute yuppies, just the worst possible version of what an upwardly mobile white guy in his 20s looks like in the 80s. But it's interesting too because he's taken some digression
about, I don't think we've done a Sam Shepard movie on the podcast yet. There are several options that I could have probably pulled from. But I also just don't think he gets his flowers in this movie enough either. Everybody in this movie works. It's not an ensemble film, by any stretch, or at least it's not considered an ensemble. Yet I think every single person is doing the utmost, to do the best work. And, Sam Shepard always gave me, he's got a real, classic film vibe to him. He would have fit, I think, very well amongst the Joel McRae's and Fred McMurray's of that time period. I think there's actually even a Sheldrake reference in this movie because somebody clearly loved The Apartment. But he has such a tenderness and a warmth to him in this role that tempers Diane Keaton's more sharp edges. And you know, when they have their first meeting and she's freaking out over the horse, the fact that he just kind of stays like straight face. And I think that him and Keaton had done a movie together before this. They worked together after this. They're clearly a screen duo that like we do not talk enough about.
Ugh, I love Sam Shepard so much. So many great low-key performances. One of my favorite romantic scenes in anything is the scene between him and Dolly Parton in Steel Magnolias right before the funeral for Julia Roberts' character. And he's been this kind of just like stubborn shithead husband the whole movie. And then, you know, the kind of next time we see him, he's asking Dolly Parton about does his tie go with his suit to go to Julia Roberts' funeral. And they have this incredibly beautiful scene in the beauty parlor that Dolly Parton is the proprietor of in Steel Magnolias. And I don't know. I think a lot about like we're just losing that class of dudes in Hollywood. Like they're not super A-list, but they're just rock steady and they bring such a gravitas to everything that they do. And you know, Sam Shepard was an incredibly handsome man, but in my opinion, the sexiest thing about him was his mind and the fact that he made all these really interesting creative choices. I was thinking about, I was like, Sam Shepard, nothing like, you know, writing the great Harry Dean Stanton monologue in Paris, Texas, and then go to the baby boom set. But I love that. Like, I think he made Fool for Love with Altman right around this time, too. The idea that he was able to kind of exist in both worlds. But they do have such great chemistry in this movie. And it just feels like one of those dynamics as soon as they start circling each other, where you're just like, oh, yeah, this is totally inevitable. These people, of course,
Exactly.
would be orbiting each other. And, you know, I appreciate that more people realized he was a very viable romantic lead coming out of movies like this, too.
Yeah, and it's amazing to get into the box office of this because this movie debuted at number 3 behind Fatal Attraction, another big Backlash movie, which ooh, I don't know how I feel about that being number 1, and the all female written Shelley Long feature Hello Again, that was number 2, written and directed and produced by Frank Perry. So I mean, those are 3 very different movies, which I don't know what that says about 1987. But reviews ultimately seem a tad mixed. Janet Maslin of the New York Times wrote that the film, quote, isn't much more than a glorified sitcom, but it's funny and it's liable to hit home, which I was like, okay, Janet, that seems a little rude. Roger Ebert gave the
Janet, you're
film
going
3
to
out
be
of
begging for glorified sitcoms in 40 years.
Roger Ebert gave the film 3 out of 4 stars and said that, quote, all of the film's storyline is too good to be true, of course, but that's why I enjoyed it. And I think that, you know, says so much. So Pauline Kael called it really loved Keaton's performance. So, you know, I think she name dropped The More the Merrier, calling her like reminiscent of Jean Arthur in that film. So, I mean, I appreciate that. The movie did have a very short lived sitcom in the year following in 1988. It was 13 episodes, and the twins who play Baby Elizabeth in this did reprise their role. Kate Jackson played JC Wyatt in the sitcom, and I have not sat down to look for it or watch it if it exists on the internet anymore. But it did make me think because Amazon is now saying Michael Showalter is going to direct a remake of Baby Boom. And I don't like to be the person that says you really can't remake movies. I mean, you can, but I think that, as we've been talking about for the last 50 odd minutes, so much of Baby Boom's power came from being released in 1987 and what it says about femininity and womanhood at the time. And on the one hand, I'm like, I would love a contemporary look at Baby Boom now. Like, does it involve JC suing the pants off of the company and like taking the money and using that to buy the house in Vermont? Is it going to talk about, you know, how different that looks for women of color? Should it talk about that? Like, these are all things where I'm just kind of like, I don't know if it's going to be able to do what it should. You know, I feel like it's gonna try to write the check, but it can't cash it. Where do you think about a remake?
I just feel like particularly films from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s have such a particular cultural context and were so already integrated into the American consciousness that the idea of taking them from their time period and just putting a modern skin on them almost never work. What I am interested in is a Michael Showalter movie about the challenges of being a mother in 2026. That's intriguing to me. There's something there. I am totally blanking on the name, so please forgive me, but there's a fabulous movie from a couple of years ago with Alana Glazer and Michelle Buteau playing best friends, navigating one of their unexpected pregnancies. And it was one of the first sort of modern movies from this era that I felt like was scratching at a lot of these issues around class, around race, around who gets to be a mom and how exactly do they get to be a mom.
It's the movie Babes, by the way.
Thank you. Directed by the great Pamela Adlon, who I think I would love to see Pamela direct some more features because that was fabulous. But that is way more intriguing. You brought up Fatal Attraction. I did watch the entire reboot Fatal Attraction TV show that they did a couple years ago. And it was sort of fascinating. I think they made some interesting creative choices. And I thought Leslie Kaplan in the Glenn Close role made some really interesting choices as an actor. But at the same time, I'm like, guys, this doesn't work. This is a Yuppies in Peril movie, and we don't have Yuppies in Peril in 2020, whatever. It's just completely divorced from the context. But you can make these kinds of stories. You just have to be grappling with contemporary issues that people are dealing with. I actually thought did a pretty good job integrating where we are now. This is going to be a very controversial take, the Hand That Rocks the Cradle remake. I thought engaged with some really interesting class questions in particular that I was like, again, I didn't need this to be a Hand That Rocks the Cradle remake, but like at least we're making some attempts at modernizing this in a way that makes it feel fresh and not just like, putting cell phones in the hands of characters that would be better off in 1987.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how quickly that movie's going to get off the ground. I will definitely have opinions when this Baby Boom remake hits. But I mean, overall, as we start wrapping things up, I think this movie it's a comfort movie for me. This is a movie that I can watch when I'm having a bad day, much like any Meyers Shire movie. You could just watch it and it's the equivalent of like being wrapped in a warm blanket. It's certainly problematic, as most movies of the past, but I do think that Pauline Kael comparing this to something like The More the Merrier, those 1940s movies. We do a bonus series on the Patreon called It's Like a Classic. You should definitely go listen to it, listeners, if you have not, where we talked about stuff like A League of Their Own and Moonstruck, and I think this is definitely one of those as well, that just has that old Hollywood sensibility to it. I know people are going to be like, you could have talked about any Diane Keaton movie that's an actual classic, like The Godfather. I don't want to. But mostly I think, too, this also shows the talent she had as a performer, the range she had, the ability she had to vacillate between these big emotions and ultimately make us root for her. And you root for JC as much as you root for any character. So that is all to say that I love it. Go watch it if you haven't. And I'm sad that we live in a world that does not have Diane Keaton in it anymore.
Ugh,
it's just
what
a bummer.
Gut punch. I don't know. There are many, many fascinatingly talented actors making movies right now, but there is a middle class of actors, particularly I would say in the 30s to 40s age range, that it just feels like we do not have contemporary equivalents to people like Diane Keaton or Sam Shepard or even like James Spader, right? Like it's just a different Hollywood. And watching movies like this, to your point that it's like a warm blanket, I watched this 500 times on TBS in the 90s because it was Saturday and that's what was on and that's just what you watched or you didn't and then you just moved on with your life. But it's really interesting thinking about I'm personally obsessed with this idea of the middle budget movie and what we need to do to get back to that space. And I think movies like this standing the test of time, even with some deeply problematic elements, really goes to show that we were just cooking with gas, man. A lot of these movies are greater than the sum of their parts. And maybe it's just because we're millennials and we have that nostalgia, but I don't fully think that's it. There's a reason 16-year-olds have been watching The Breakfast Club for 40 years. That movie has some not great stuff in it, but we can sort of work within that. Or to your point about, the kind of women's pictures of the 40s and 50s, anybody asking those to hold up to 2026 woke standards, what are you doing? That is not a helpful exercise. But what we can do is we can look back on those movies and say, hey, wow, this element was actually a lot more progressive than anybody gave it credit for at the time. And I think that is kind of my big takeaway from Baby Boom too. Like, yes, there's some failures, there's some white feminism of it all, but thanks to things like Diane Keaton's performance in this great script, the movie kind of transcends even some of those issues.
Exactly. Well, Kate, it's always great to get to hang out with you and chat. I thank you so much for wanting to jump on the podcast and talk with us about this. Where can fans find you online? What do you have coming up? Anything they should be on the lookout for?
Sure. Okay, briefly, I am going to plug one more Diane Keaton movie since this is Diane Keaton centric.
Do it.
For a completely different Diane Keaton, I'm going to recommend you seek out Shoot the Moon, which I think might be the best movie anybody's ever made about the impact of divorce. It's Diane Keaton and Albert Finney doing a Bo Goldman script, and it is just an absolute masterclass in American domestic drama. Where can people find me? I am very easy to find online. Kate Hagen. All of my handles are that Hagen girl spelled like Riot Girl, GRRL. My website is katehagen.co. Coming up, I'm going to do another podcast with my friend Erin Bowles that will be out in March, talking about some YA that we love. I don't want to spoil the book we're going to talk about. That's not really a YA book, but it's about a young female character. And I should have some more writing coming down the pipeline later this spring, which is exciting too. And, I go to
Well, that's going to close out Ticklish Business for this episode. You can always